Well, welcome everyone to the final lecture in the Center for the Environment's Biodiversity, Ecology, and Global Change series. This is the end of our third season of talks. We have a great lecture today. Before going on to that, I need to once again thank Bank of America, our corporate sponsor, for underwriting this series. I can think of no better person to help us celebrate Earth Day than Aaron Ellison. Not only is Aaron one of the most well-known and influential ecologists in the world today, but he's also one of our own. Many of you may not know that because he's out at the Harvard Forest, a senior research fellow at our own Harvard Forest. Aaron's influence in the field has been felt in a number of different ways. First, he has played an important role in developing ways of thinking about statistical analysis in ecology. For example, he was an early and vocal proponent of the use of Bayesian methods and wrote several influential papers on that topic. More generally, he has written what is widely considered among ecologists to be the Bible of statistics, his A Primer of Ecological Statistics, co-written with Nick Gotelli. Second, Aaron's influence in the field is seen in his editorial duties. Since 2002, Aaron has been the associate editor-in-chief of two of the most important journals in the field, the journals of the Ecological Society of America, namely Ecology and Ecological Monographs. And this year, he stepped up to being the editor-in-chief of Ecological Monographs. Now, as you know, the scientific publishing has changed greatly over the last decade, and I think Aaron and his other editors have done an excellent job of keeping the ESA journals at the forefront in terms of publishing ecological research. Finally, of course, is Aaron's research, and Aaron's research is really remarkably wide-ranging and synthetic, including topics as diverse as the study of food webs in non-equilibrial habitats that change through time, the spatial dimension of species interactions, nutrient limitation and stoichiometry of carnivorous plants, the effects of climate change on ecological interactions, and the ecology and diversity of ants. The breadth of Aaron's work can be seen by his current grant support. He currently has 3 NSF grants on forest dynamics, how species interactions change across space, and how global change is occurring at the landscape level. In addition, he has 2 Department of Energy grants on the effects of global warming on ants and the role that ants play in the ecosystem, and on tree recruitment. These 5 grants in sum total to well over $10 million. These are all current grants. Aaron's topic today is very appropriate for Earth Day. Relying on a variety of his own studies from Harvard Forest and elsewhere, Aaron will discuss the challenges that global change, loss of ecological knowledge, and the inherent complexity of ecological systems present for rehabilitating, rebuilding, and restoring ecosystems. Aaron, thanks very much for speaking to us today.
Kind introduction. I hope the talk serves well. Today is the 39th anniversary of Earth Day, and I thought I'd take this opportunity of the Earth Day anniversary to reflect broadly on issues that we think about on Earth Day and how some of my own research at least has contributed to how we think about this now. Being Earth Day, we have lots of accomplishments and achievements to celebrate. Many species have been brought back from the edge of extinction. For example, the bald eagle, which was listed actually under the precursor to the Endangered Species Act in 1967, only a few years after Silent Spring, called our attention to the perils of organophosphates, insecticides in our environment. And in fact, the bald eagle was delisted, considered no longer endangered in 2007. In fact, the Fish and Wildlife Service now has a legal take on bald eagles. So in some parts of the country, you can now shoot them again. But for ecologists, environmental scientists, environmentalists at large, even though we have lots of things to celebrate, we also have a lot of hard work that's just beginning for us when we think about how we're going to repair, rehabilitate, and restore ecosystems on which we all depend. I want you to think back, those of you who are old enough to remember, 39 years ago. Earth Day was conceptualized in 1969 by the Democratic senator from Wisconsin, Gaylord Nelson. It was organized by a young Harvard intern named Dennis Hayes, who dropped out of the Kennedy School to go work as a staffer for Nelson, and he never came back, subsequently completing his law degree elsewhere. But he coordinated Earth Day activities around the United States. There were approximately 20 million people that got organized for demonstrations, for organizing, and most importantly, for creating organizations that are still in play today. Perhaps less well appreciated at the time, this is the trace of atmospheric concentration of carbon dioxide from 1957 up until Earth Day in 1970, taken from the Mauna Loa Observatory. And there's a slight uptick here in the early 1970s that really wasn't appreciated at the time. And at the time, a lot of other things were changing that we now only recognize in hindsight. And we'll talk about some of those today. 2 years before Earth Day, we had gotten our first view of the first really good and compelling view of the planet from space when the Apollo 8 astronauts took this image called Earthrise on Christmas Eve, 1968. Just after Earth Day, the Cuyahoga River in Cleveland caught fire for the 9th time in 100 years. And this combination of seeing the planet from space, of getting people organized, and of having rivers catch fire really galvanized the consciousness at the time. And it led to a whole lot of political action, the kinds that we really haven't seen in the last nearly 40 years. For example, within 3 years, we had 3 major pieces of environmental legislation signed: the Clean Air Act, the Endangered Species Act, and significant updates to the Clean Water Act, all signed by then President Nixon, no friend of the liberal agenda. These pieces of environmental legislation had dramatic and immediate tangible effects. Example shown here, one consequence of the Clean Air Act, besides cleaning up our cities, was that we phased out lead from gasoline. And the lead levels in children dropped immediately. Rivers got cleaned up under the Clean Water Act. This is the Cuyahoga River today in downtown Cleveland. About a dozen fish species now live in this river, which was burning from its petroleum pollution not 40 years ago. Closer to home, this is the Connecticut River in 1975. I live in the western part of the state. And the Connecticut River ran a whole host of very interesting colors. This particular tributary of the Connecticut, the Millers River, runs this color ran this color because of the paper mills upstream that were actually some of the first paper mills to recycle paper in the United States. And so one of the byproducts of recycling paper in the late 60s and early 70s was this really interesting sets of color on the river. And this is the pollution plume entering the Connecticut River in 1975. Now we have tertiary treatment, and the Connecticut River is much cleaner once again. Like the Cuyahoga in Ohio, we have fish back in the Connecticut River, but one of the key things is we don't have all the fish, just like there aren't all the fish back in the Cuyahoga. For example, salmon, this is the Atlantic salmon up here, and every year the salmon has been extinct from the Connecticut River, extirpated, I guess is the correct term, from the Connecticut River since the 1800s. And as part of the salmon recovery plan, the Fish and Wildlife Service dumps about 3 million little salmon every year into the Connecticut River in the hopes that they'll come back. And this is the trace, since they began doing this in the 1970s, of how many salmon come back to the Connecticut River in all the different tributaries or main stems. And the one that I want to call your attention to here is the central New England one, the light blue one, which is the Connecticut River. The numbers here that are coming back in 2005, 2006 are on the order of a dozen salmon. So you release 3 million, you get a dozen back in a good year. This is not a really good thing for the system, and this loss of top predators is something that we'll discuss as we go through here today. But in general, the news is not too bad. With 40 years of legislation behind us, with a lot of really good scientific research translated into concerted action, we've kept lots of species, up to 99% of species that have been listed as threatened or endangered in the last 40 years have not gone extinct. So that's viewed as a key success. We have cleaner water, we have cleaner air, we have cleaner cities. What are the challenges that we face today? So the three challenges that I want to talk about that form the focus of this discussion and that let us think about what we need to do to repair and restore ecosystems at risk, these three challenges are unprecedentedly rapid global climate change, the inherent complexity of ecological systems, and the loss at the same time of the ecological knowledge that we need in order to rebuild these. So I want to take each of these in turn. We'll start with rapid global change. Senator Nelson, who conceptualized Earth Day, was also known for his serious and significant interest in population issues. In 1969, when he was thinking about the first Earth Day, we had just under 4 billion people on the planet. 40 years later, we're pushing 7 billion people on the planet. The rate of increase has been relatively constant from the 1950s till now. It's been basically a straight line up. The slope is not changing dramatically. This is basically a linear increase in the number of people on the planet. But this kind of increase that we saw here, this is unprecedented in the history of people, going back 10,000 years before the Common Era. At the same time, global economic activity expressed here as the gross domestic product at the global level has also gone up very dramatically. And this hockey stick graph looks a lot like the population graph, but not exactly. Because while population in the last 50 years has gone up linearly, GDP has gone up exponentially. This is really a good thing. People live longer, we're more productive, we're happier people. We have about 4 times the purchasing power as individuals that we did 50 years ago, notwithstanding the most recent economic downturn. This is generally viewed as a positive thing. How have we done this, and what does it mean for the planet? Well, I would argue first that one of the ways that we've done this is that we have figured out how to extract more from the environment. And one of the things that we extract a lot of is nitrogen, which we use for fertilizer, industrial things. And back in the 1900s, these two German chemists, Haber and Bosch, discovered how to chemically fix the nitrogen in the atmosphere that before then we really had to rely on lightning and legumes and rhizobial bacteria to do. And in the last 50 years, along with the rise in population and the rise in GDP, we have an exponential rise in the amount of nitrogen that people fix and use. And in fact, the amount that we now fix is equal to the amount that the biosphere does all by itself. There's a very interesting dip here in 1990 and 91. Everyone know what happened in 90 and 91? That was the last big economic recession, the stock market crash in '89 that led to a prolonged economic downturn. less use of fossil fuels, less use of fertilizer, rapid recovery within about 2 years, and on its way back up. At the same time that we burn all these fossil fuels and fix all this nitrogen, it's going up into the atmosphere. This is arguably the most famous graph of the 20th century and now into the 21st century. The concentration of atmospheric carbon dioxide having gone from 320 parts per million in the at the beginning of the record in the 1960s to just over 380 parts per million today, with what we feel here is the obvious impact of global temperature change, in which we study in great detail at the Harvard Forest and elsewhere around the university. Like the changes in population size, like the change in global economic development and the change in carbon dioxide and the change in nitrogen fixation, all of these activities are increasing and changing at unprecedented rates, certainly in human history. One of the consequences of this is that human beings now use about half of the net primary production of the planet. So one way to think about this is you can think that all the energy at base that comes to the planet comes from the sun. What doesn't get reflected back as heat gets fixed by plants, and everything we do, whether it's eating plants or eating things that eat plants or building houses out of wood or burning fossil fuels, which are fossilized plants, uses energy that was originally captured by plants. And that energy that we use now accounts for 50% of that available energy coming in. So we call this the human appropriation of net primary production, or the percent of total. And these big numbers here, the dark numbers, are where it's up over 40, 50%. And if you aggregate this over the entire planet, arable land surface of the land and the productive surface of the water, humans are up around 40 to 50 to 60% appropriating all the energy that comes into the planet. We use a lot of this at base for agriculture, and this lower figure shows that in lots of these same places in North America, Europe, India, China, Sub-Saharan Africa, where we're using a lot of the net primary productivity, we're also in overdraft, as it were, of our water. So we're using more water to do this than is getting recharged in our aquifers. Another way to conceptualize this, a sort of encapsulation of this, is called our ecological footprint. It's a very clever graphical illustration, and it basically says how many planets does it take to provide the material wealth and sustenance that all of us depend on. So back at the first Earth Day here, our baseline of 1970, we needed about half a planet to support 4 billion people at the standard of living to which they were all accustomed in 1970. Now, 40 years later, we're at about 1.25 planets. And we're right on track to needing 2 planets by the year 2030. Now, I'm sure the current economic depression will take a little bite out of this, but as we saw with the graph of nitrogen, it's not likely to take a very big bite out of it for very long. The lower graph here would be a rapid reduction in use here to get us back to only needing 1 planet, but this would be a very dramatic change in our lifestyles. This is another way to look at exactly the same information. This is a cartogram showing the ecological deficit based on ecological footprints around the world. So places like the United States, Western Europe, Japan are all running an ecological deficit of about 11, meaning that we need in our place about 11 hectares per capita We don't have 11 hectares per person on the planet. A hectare is about 2.5 acres. That's about 25 acres. But basically what we're doing to service our deficit is we're mining the future of these countries that are not running in ecological deficit. Here's yet another way to look at this. This is a graph put together by the World Wildlife Fund, and it shows the change in our ecological footprints since 1975. And this is as close as we can get to the first Earth Day, up to the year 2003 when this was put together. So what we have here is we have trajectories that are running from 1975 to 2003. The different parts of the world are in different colors. The size of the circles is proportional to population size. The y-axis tells us our ecological footprint per hectare per person. So here's us up here at about 10 or 11. And down here is the Human Development Index, which is put together by the United Nations. It's an aggregate index of GDP and lifespan and other quality of life issues. And basically, the good news out of this figure is most countries are moving from the left side of this graph to the right side of this graph. So the Human Development Index is improving. People are living longer, they're living better, they're more literate. At the same time, though, they're moving up the y-axis. So they're taking more resources in order to do that. There are two lines here. One is the threshold we'll start with for high human development. So this is basically the area that people want to be. Good schools, good places to live, all those sorts of things. But in order to do this, just as within the last slide, we're running an ecological debt. We're incurring an ecological debt that future generations will have to pay off. And as folks said a couple weeks ago at the G20 summit, those that weren't allowed in to talk to the world's leaders, nature doesn't do bailouts. Nature can't print new matter. It can't print new species like our governments can print new money. And so somehow this debt is going to have to be paid off. But there's a third message in this figure that's also really small. And that's this line here, which is the world average, some of you probably can't read this, the world average biocapacity available per person, ignoring the needs of wild species. So basically, remember, humans now have appropriated 50% of the net primary productivity, and this is saying this is what the planet could support in terms of a human footprint, about just under 2 hectares per person, if you ignore the needs of all the wild species, all 10 million or so of them that we share the planet with, recognizing we've only domesticated about 1,000 of them. What's happening to these species if most of these countries are getting pretty close to this line? Well, the short answer is, of course, there are fewer of them, right? This is the data from the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment looking at extinction rates in the distant past, the fossil record, the current past, and the modeled future. This is a logarithmic scale, so you can see that species are going extinct at about 1,000 times the rate that they were before humans started doing all these things. And this isn't reflected in fish and wildlife statistics, which are all about listing big, charismatic, happy species. This is probably mostly insects, arthropods, bacteria, things that we really can't see. Now, on the one hand, you could say, well, this is okay. There are fewer species that we're going to have to share the planet's productivity with. There's less for them. There's more for us. That's okay. But on the other hand, we're going to have to pick up that slack somehow. We're going to have to do something about this to pay off that debt. We depend on all these species in lots and lots of different ways for what we call ecosystem services. Food, fiber, clothing, clean water, clean air. The last time someone tried to put a dollar figure on that in 1997, that number was $33 trillion, which was about twice the global GDP at the time. So that's a lot of things. Give you 2 examples. One, this is the Quabbin Reservoir out near where I live. Everyone know the importance of the Quabbin Reservoir here in Boston? Of course you all know the importance of the Quabbin Reservoir. This is where your drinking water comes from. The state took by eminent domain 4 towns in the 1930s, flooded a big chunk of forest, put a fence around it, and ran a pipe from there to Boston. And all the towns, a lot of the towns in between that are sort of east of 495. This is an untreated water supply. EPA estimates it would cost over $1 billion to put a treatment plant in for all the stuff that we're getting for free from the 45,000 acres of forest that are protected around this watershed. The other example that I want to show is that about the importance of biodiversity and extinctions is taken from this remarkable photograph that I grabbed from Eric Chivian's new book on sustainability that I recommend everyone should read here. This picture really got me when I heard Eric give a talk about this. It's taken on the border of China and Nepal, where the bees have gone extinct, and women pollinate the apple trees. It takes 20 to 25 people to pollinate 100 trees, which is something that 2 colonies of bees would do for nothing. They take a little pollen off the top. Economists would consider this a net positive contribution to GDP. You've got people employed in productive labor. Ecologists might think about this somehow differently. But fortunately, bees haven't gone extinct everywhere, and we still have the opportunity to restore them along with the planet's other systems on which we depend. Honeybees, like apple trees and people, are players in complex ecological systems. What is our current understanding of ecological complexity? It seems appropriate this year. This is the 200th anniversary of the birth of Charles Darwin. I'm sure everyone here knows that because it's all over the news and certainly the biology departments. 150th anniversary of the publication of The Origin of Species. And he wrote 150 years ago, the last paragraph of The Origin of Species, he wrote, "It is interesting to contemplate an entangled bank clothed with many plants of many kinds, with birds singing on the bushes, with various insects flitting about and with worms crawling through the damp earth, and to reflect that these elaborately constructed forms, so different from each other and depend on each other in a complex manner." So he had a good sense of ecological complexity. And in trying to understand and eventually restore ecosystems, as ecologists, environmental scientists, and environmentalists, we nonetheless have a long tradition of ignoring this complexity. We do this and we narrow our focus to manageable portions of the ecosystem. Let me give you a couple of examples from my own work. This is a photograph of a tropical coastal forest, a mangrove forest in Venezuela. I'm particularly fond of this, thinking about tangled banks. Mangroves are not very species rich in terms of the trees involved. There are only 3 species of trees in this entire forest. They've got some birds. There's a scarlet ibis in the middle here. There's some biting insects. There's some crabs, those sorts of things. If you go underwater, this is what the roots look like underwater. Mangroves in the Caribbean merge almost directly with coral reefs. With corals, they're nursery grounds for fish. There are hundreds of species of organisms that live just on these roots. How do we even begin to tease apart and understand the relationships and the complexity between what's going on underwater on the roots and what's going on right above the waterline there? One way we do this is we talk about food webs. This is a classic example of a food web. Every child knows all about the food chain now. This is, in fact, a high school drawing. It's missing a lot of stuff, right? This is just not obviously adequate to deal with a mangrove food web. Here's an ecologist's vision of a coral reef. This works the same way. You've got primary producers, that's plants here at the bottom, things that eat plants here in the middle, things that eat plants at the top, and top carnivores up at the bottom. Up at the top. There are a lot more species shown than there were in the elementary school version. But in its own way, this illustration of a coral reef food web is still inadequate. There are only 2 species here of primary producers, algae, phytoplankton, detritus, even though on your average coral reef in the Caribbean, there are hundreds, maybe thousands of species in these red dots. 85% of the balls in this diagram represent fish, even though probably 95% of the diversity on coral reefs are invertebrates. This kind of, and this is just the coral reef, the pieces of the mangrove, the leaves that fall into the water that the bacteria decompose and use to get started aren't there. People that fish out the coral reef aren't there. Birds that eat the fish aren't there. This kind of partitioning, mental partitioning, plays out in how we manage these systems. So this is a managed mangrove forest in Malaysia that I visited. And this section of forest has been, this big chunk of forest has been managed for about 100 years for charcoal and things, and it's managed by the forestry department. Right next to the mangroves, you've got the cockle fishermen and fisherwomen who are collecting shellfish. They're managed by the fisheries department. This is our thoughts about sort of linking these pieces in a mangrove food web. We've got the tree. We've got a tree-based food web that a terrestrial ecologist might study, a benthic food web that a benthic ecologist might study, a pelagic web that a blue water ecologist might study. All the red boxes are things we manage or eat or use, all being managed by different agencies that rarely talk to each other. The consequences are probably obvious. We do the same thing here in the United States, and I'll give you one example, a much more pedestrian example perhaps. This is how we restore and manage a wetland in Massachusetts. Massachusetts has the strictest wetlands laws in the United States, probably some of the strictest in the world. Can't take wetlands without replacing wetlands. So this is a wetland replacement plan for the town of Royalston, where I live, where in reconstructing a road, they're going to impact 2,000 square feet of wetland, so about a 1/20th of an acre. Massachusetts calls for 2-for-1 replication, so they've got to put in 4,000 square feet of wetland. Doesn't sound like a lot. It's about twice the size of this room. So what they're going to do is they're going to take 2 perfectly beautiful pieces of forest adjacent to a wetland. They're going to drive in some backhoes. They're going to scrape these down to groundwater level, put in some mud, and then they're going to plant 24 red maples, 10 winterberries, 10 blueberries, and 30 ferns. Then they're going to monitor this for 5 years, and if everything lives, the Conservation Commission in town is going to sign off and say, you did your job. Okay? Now, I'm a Conservation Commissioner, so on Tuesday, next week, I'm going to sign off and approve this plan because it meets the law. And 5 years from now, I'll be going out there and making sure those plants live. I'm going to sign off and say, your wetland is successful. I know this is garbage, right? There's no butterflies, there are no beetles, there are no birds, there's nothing that they have to worry about. But this is how we manage a wetland because that's where we've partitioned this. On the surface, this may seem sensible and efficient to manage resources. Plant ecologists study plants and they manage wetlands. Animal ecologists study animals and they manage animals. We even have separate ecological subdisciplines. I get pigeonholed as a community ecologist. I study communities. What kind of communities? Well, there are plant communities, there are ant communities, there are bird communities, there are lizard communities. Why do we do this? This is like, I did this as an exercise. This is like taking a system, a camera, and taking it apart. And now you've got the plant community ecologist who's going to study the screws and come up with all sorts of interesting things about distribution and abundance of camera screws. Right? You know, this seems really crazy. I would point out, and we'll come back to this a little later, it took my research assistant 2 weeks, 2 weeks of not full-time work, to take this camera apart to this couple of hundred pieces, right? Then we have to put them back together to get the camera again. It's not digital. It's a little easier. It's got gears and things. And we didn't even, we lost some of the parts. So that's a hard thing to do. But we really do this, right? I mean, that sounds really dumb when you talk about a camera. So I'm going to give you some examples from what community ecologists do. So here's what ant community ecologists do. This is data that I took with Nick Gatelli. This shows the ant communities of bogs in white circles and white triangles, and forests surrounding the bogs in black triangles over 3 degrees of latitude in New England. And this is from Vermont on this side, northern Vermont, to southern Massachusetts on this side. And we see the predictable increase in the number of species of ants as we go closer to the equator. And you see this, of course, in the inset where you're going all the way to the equator. You see exactly the same pattern. So ant ecologists say, wow, ants, there's this thing going on with ants. This has been going on for a very long time, that ant community ecologists do this. This is one of the classic figures in ant ecology, data figures, taken by one of the classic figures in ant ecology, our own Ed Wilson, of the diversity of numbers of species of ants on islands in the New Guinea archipelago in the 1950s. And the key insight here is that bigger islands have more species of ants. This was elaborated by looking at a lot of different kinds of communities. You say you got bigger space, you got more species, therefore if you want to preserve biodiversity and protect species, you need bigger nature reserves. There's a lot of debate and discussion about this in the 70s and the 80s. Hasn't really been resolved in any particularly satisfying way, but there's this general notion that bigger is somewhat better. In principle, the idea here is if you want to conserve something, like, say, this food web on a coral reef, you make a big preserve, like a big marine preserve, to preserve the fish, and everything else will take care of themselves. Is this actually true? Is that theory actually correct? How would you test that theory? It turns out that it's actually really hard to test that theory because you don't want to go around and grab predators out of grab systems and change their size on them, deliberately anyway. And if you're thinking about comparing that possibility to just say the size of the habitat with whether these top predators are around or not, you don't want to go shooting lions in order to see if taking away your top predator means anything. So it's taken a long time to actually test this, and Nick Gatelli and I have been working on this for about a decade now using our friend the pitcher plant. This is the northern pitcher plant here in this particular photograph's taken in New Hampshire. It's a carnivorous plant. Everyone loves carnivorous plants, so it makes good copy, and grant agencies seem to like to give us money to talk about it. But what's important here is that inside the mouth of this pitcher plant, which fills up with rainwater, we have an entire food web. We've got a 4 or 5 trophic level food web with bacteria and prey coming in and getting ground up and moving its way through the food web. So we can look at a food web with all the pieces in it. And we can say, what would happen in this food web, in this ecosystem, if we took out the top predator, just like we've taken out the salmon and the top predator out of the Connecticut River? What would happen if we changed the ecosystem size by manipulating how much water there is in the pitcher plant itself, so that we can change simultaneously the size of the habitat and the structure of the food web? And this was the first time anyone had actually tried to do that. Here are 3 different ways to conceptualize how these models, how the system might work. You can imagine in this classic model of island biogeography that if habitat size changes, the volume of water changes, it's going to have some effect on all the components of the food web, but they otherwise don't interact with each other. And the arrows here tell you how strong those interactions actually are. Another way to think about it is if you change the top predator in the system and they all interact, those interactions are again one way with no interaction among species in the web or with volume. Or you could have a model where you've got volume interacting with food webs and all the different things in different ways. And there are lots and lots of different models that you could come up with. These are just 3. But the take-home message, which we have illustrated quantitatively in this slide, the best fitting model is, all you need to know here is the best fitting model is the one with the lowest score on the y-axis. And up here we have single factor models where you don't have interactions in the food web, and down here you have food web models. Here it's no links between volume and the food webs, and down here you've got all these links. And the bottom line is that the best fitting models are the food web models and the models with the predator in them. And so the take-home message of this is that predators matter, habitat size matters because it matters for predators, but you actually have to deal with the whole system. You can't just deal with one set of screws at a time. Ecologists are often accused of quantifying the obvious, and this doesn't seem like rocket science, but it did take a long time for someone to come up with it. Nonetheless, we are doing this same kind of experiment, perhaps not deliberately, every day, where we're taking these top predators out of systems and watching what happens. So the y-axis here is the height of the food web, so how many top predators you have in it in the open ocean. So we've been eating a lot of tuna fish and swordfish, big top predators in the system, and so the trophic structure of the marine food webs in the North Atlantic, the coastal shelves, all marine, is consistently going down in our same Earth Day history time period. We're taking the top predators out of this system. And of course, pitcher plant food webs are not the only part of its food web either. Okay, so here's the little piece we studied, but at the same time you've got moths coming in and eating the food web, the pitchers, and taking habitat away. You've got pitchers embedded in matrices of habitat and habitats being scattered around the landscape. So you have all these pieces. You have fragmented habitats. You have pieces of habitat going extinct, all happening on these little microecosystems. And after 13 years of working now on this particular system, we've really barely just begun to scratch the surface of this. It took us almost 10 years just to work out this chunk of it, and now we're moving on to working onto the other pieces. And this is something we can actually get at. We can do experiments with. This is not like dealing with tuna fish in the open ocean. Yet I would assert that trying to understand and manage this kind of complexity is the most important thing that we have to do in the next 40 or 50 years. And at the same time that we're finally really realizing that we have to come to grips with this complexity, that it's not enough to just stop polluting a river or stop spraying DDT. At the same time, we're losing the knowledge about how to do this. And so I want to essentially finish up pieces here about talking about how we're losing this knowledge. Again, we will return to the marine environment to start with mangroves. And I want to bring up a concept that ecologists, marine ecologists, have developed in the last 10, 15 years. And the concept is that of the shifting baseline. And I'm going to illustrate the shifting baseline by example. So my own career now as an ecologist spans over 30 years. is a scary thought. And at the same time, for about half of that time, when I haven't been working on pitcher plants, I've spent a lot of time in mangrove forests with Elizabeth Farnsworth. We conducted a lot of research in these forests in the 1980s and 1990s, studying the food webs, the connections between below the water, above the water. We spend a lot of time in the water. You would think anyone spending a lot of time in the water who grew up on Jacques Cousteau episodes, we would have seen a sea turtle. Gotta love sea turtles. And in fact, sea turtles are the primary herbivore, that next step up after primary producers, in coastal ecosystems. The big underwater thing is called turtle grass, after all, for a reason. And so, spending a lot of time in the water, I ought to see some turtles. And in 15 years working in mangroves, I've seen turtles twice. In fact, I've seen 2 turtles. This is the first turtle I saw in 1988 when a team of Earthwatch volunteers helping us out went down to the fish co-op and bought it off a fisherman and then brought it back to the beach and had a release party. I imagine the fisherman caught it the next day, brought it back, sold it again, crazy gringos. The second time I saw a sea turtle was 6 years later. Okay, I saw this sea turtle, also a green turtle, as like the last one was, when we were working in Palau in Micronesia. Let me reiterate that. Twice in 15 years, thousands of hours spent underwater, twice I saw a sea turtle, the major grazer of tropical coastal ecosystems. That'd be like spending all your 15 years in East Africa and seeing 2 wildebeest. It'd be like spending 15 years in Wisconsin and seeing 2 cows. I mean, this is crazy. And let you think that this is atypical. My colleague Jeremy Jackson, who gave a talk about 4 years ago now in the Radcliffe Institute, works at Scripps, and he wrote in 1997, so 10 years ago, that despite thousands of his hours scuba diving off the coral reefs of Jamaica, in 20 years he'd rarely seen manatees, dugongs, stingrays, or turtles. The dominant grazers in the system, basically absent over a 20-year period of arguably some of the most important marine biology research going on. Now, in contrast, let me read you a passage that was written in 1494 by a guy named Andres Bernaldez. He was writing about Columbus's second voyage. And he wrote, in those 20 leagues near southeastern Cuba, they saw many more green turtles, for the sea was thick with them. And they were of the very largest, so numerous that it seemed that the ships would run aground on them and were as if bathing in them. 300 years later, in 1774, the historian Edward Long wrote that seagoing vessels in the 1600s and 1700s, which have lost their way in hazy and cloudy weather west of the Cayman Islands, have steered entirely by the noise made by green turtles to get themselves to land. Can you imagine the ocean so thick with turtles? I can't imagine that. This is not a surprise that I can't imagine it. This is data about turtles, about sea turtles. Sea turtles have been listed as endangered species for quite a long time now. This shows us the nesting population change for data that are collected over the short term, 1995, ending in 1995 to 2001, or long-term data. So short-term data, the blue dots, suggest that we're seeing a dramatic increase in nesting. And the Fish and Wildlife Service is cheering this on and thinking about what we need to get to in order to delist the turtles. The long-term data, the red circles, and even half the blue circles, suggest that nests are declining. What does this mean? This is one example of the shifting baseline. If we had begun to study turtles in the Caribbean on, say, Earth Day in 1970, 40 years later, we'd say, yeah, we got some pretty good data, right? There's that 40-year point. Turtles are recovering. But if we'd started our study in 1945, we would know that all our populations are declining. And our criteria for delisting the turtles might be completely different. I point out that even these good numbers, the estimates are that current population sizes are 0.3% of historical populations. And the Fish and Wildlife Service suggests delisting when it doubles the numbers that we have today, which would be 0.6% of historical populations. Let me continue briefly with the marine theme because this is a very immediate thing for me. When I began working in mangroves in the mid-1980s in Belize, this is what I would swim over to get to my study sites. Some of the most magnificent coral reefs in the world in Belize. I went back and visited these reefs just 2 months ago, and I'm sorry to say it just doesn't look like this anymore. So this is 1988. This is 1995, a nice shelf of at least still living Agaricea. In 1998, it had started bleaching pretty dramatically. By 2002, only the Acropora in this picture was still alive. This is all the same shot. And in 2005, and currently today, there is no live coral here. This is all one species of sponge as far as the eye can see. Now, this is not to be depressing here. This is just to say if I had started studying this system in 2008, I'd have a completely different set of expectations of how this system would work. That's the shifting baseline. One more example from the marine realm I was reminded of in an article I read this morning. This is the cod fishery off of New England. We all care deeply about cod here in Massachusetts. In 1850, the estimate of the biomass of cod on one little piece, the Scotia Shelf of the New England fishing grounds, was about 1,300,000 metric tons, so about 13 million metric tons. Okay? This is the estimated carrying capacity. These are the confidence intervals, so this is not a bad estimate. These are cod. This is the take from the entire Northeast Atlantic Shelf, all of Georges Bank, all of Scotia Shelf since Earth Day in 1970. Right here, this little peak, that's what we're managing for right now. That's where the fishermen and women would like us to get back to so they can fish the bejesus out of the cod, right? When our new and most excellent head of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, Jane Lubchenco, who I think spoke in this series a couple years ago, made compromises 2 weeks ago about the amount of take that the fishermen could take off of Georges Bank. This is where we're working with. We're picking up crumbs here, right? But this is all we know, right? This is our regulatory framework. This is our shifting baseline. We're watching a similar play out right now in the forests of New England where I work, and again, not for the first time. Eastern hemlock, our late successional, iconic, poetry-driving tree of New England, is slowly disappearing. It's disappearing in part because of this small exotic insect, the hemlock woolly adelgid, that does this to our hemlock forests and knocks trees down. And in part, it's disappearing because we look at this happening and we say, wow, this is really bad for economics. We better take the trees out before they all disappear and they're valueless. Now, in 2008, we are losing more trees, more hemlock in central New England from logging than we are from this past. Along with this loss of hemlock, this late successional species, go all the things that depend on it. The ants, the warblers, all the things that are hemlock specialists. Will anyone know this when they walk around the woods in 100 years? Do any of you know that 100 years ago, this is what we had in our forests? That up to 25% of our forests were American chestnut. And like hemlock, chestnut fed wildlife, it made lumber for wood, did all these important things. And again, it was lost to an exotic pest, and it was lost to people going in and logging before we had a chance to screen for resistance. The average hiker walking through a New England forest today has no idea that we used to have all this chestnut. We see woods, and in fact, ecologists studying New England forests today are studying a very different woods, a very diminished forest. Not only chestnut is gone, but the animals that depend on it is gone. So what changes await us in the future? What is our new baselines? First off, the climate will continue to change. This is examples from the Union of Concerned Scientists. It's illustrating what the summer heat index, how hot it feels like in Massachusetts and eastern Pennsylvania will be over the next 100 years in two emission scenarios, high emissions and lower emissions, relative to the 1990 baseline. The first thing is 2010 is now. We are already living in New York climate. Pennsylvania is already living in Maryland climate. And, you know, some of us, we really like heat and humidity. You know, it'll be all right to live in Georgia in 50 or 60 years. Our legislators are dealing with the same shifting baseline. This is examples of where the legislation is proposing we go for carbon dioxide emissions in the next 20 years, now 10 years. Right? The Kyoto Protocol, for reference, would bring us down to 6,000 million tons. All these other proposals in the U.S. Congress from the last Congress, there's none out yet from this Congress, bring us to even higher levels. None of them stabilize at 320 or even 350 parts per million, which is where we would have been at in the 1990 baseline, which is what's considered now the minimum acceptable ecological sustainable place, much less where we were back at Earth Day 1970. Let me point out as well that this continues to run that ecological debt into the future. Where does this carbon go that we put out? It gets sucked up by vegetation, by the oceans, to the tune of about 5 billion tons or 5,000 million tons of CO2 per year. This bottom line here, this axis, that's what the biosphere sucks up. Anything more than that, the biosphere isn't going to suck up. So we keep accruing the debt. The only way to bring it down is to bring this number down below here so we can start paying down this debt. And every one of these proposals, like the Kyoto Protocol, like the Harvard Greenhouse Gas Protocol, all have different baselines, a 1990 baseline, a 2006 baseline, whatever. Ecological knowledge is also disappearing in more fundamental ways. Anyone recognize this list? This made the news about a week ago. These are the words, 75% of the words that are being dropped from the new edition of the Oxford Junior Dictionary, the dictionary used by all school kids in the United Kingdom. This is 75% of the words being lost are environmental words. What do you think they're being replaced with? Blog, broadband, MP3 player, voicemail, database, attachment, cut and paste, bullet point. Interestingly, they are adding the word food chain, but we won't know what's in the food chain. Now, we can laugh. This is across the pond on the other side of the ocean. This is here at home. This is a photo from another soon-to-be extinct species, the Boston Globe, from 2 months ago. Actually, I think it's from November. I think it's from November last year, when the New England Aquarium here in Boston introduced iPod tours of the aquarium. So you can walk around with your iPod and learn what's going on. I think it'd be better if they just turn around and look at the fish, but that's just me. And like the pitcher plants being fragmented by moths, our landscape is being fragmented. Right here in Massachusetts, we have what we think of as the death by 1,000 cuts. All of these little points of light here are land converted from forest to farmland since Earth Day in 1970. So we're changing the structure of this habitat, these food webs, these things, to asphalts and subdivisions, and we're simplifying these complex systems. Whether it's losses of wolves or salmon or other top predators, or losses of insects, microbes, or any of the other little things that we think run the world, or replacement of real wetlands with constructed wetlands. Right? This is a constructed wetland in Maryland. It even comes with a visitor center. Right? And these guys, they use them to treat stormwater. It works really, really well. But it costs millions of dollars to make one of these things, which the environment is already doing us for free. We can see all these changes mirrored in our forests, like in this lake in the woods, where we have beautiful woods, beautiful bogs, surprisingly little wildlife, given that we're in the middle of nowhere. And we can see the same thing in our small pools of water in our pitcher plants. We see the same fragmentation, we see the same food webs, we see the same interactions. More than half a century ago, again, going back well before Earth Day, Aldo Leopold wrote, the outstanding scientific discovery of the 20th century is not television or radio, but rather the complexity of the organism. Only those of us who know the most about it can appreciate how little we know about it. The last word in ignorance is the person who says of an animal or a plant, what good is it? If the mechanism, the processes, the ecosystem function as a whole is good, then every part is good, whether we understand it or not. Every screw, every spring, every cog in the wheel. If the biota in the course of eons has built something we like but we do not understand, who but a fool would discard the seemingly useless parts? He argued then, he concluded that to say that to keep every cog and wheel is the first precaution of intelligent tinkering. If we're going to restore these systems, we have to have all the pieces. And restoring these systems will be the new craft work, I would argue, of the 21st century. Like the craftsmen and craftswomen before us, ecologists and restoration biologists need to understand all the parts. We need to know what they are. And we need to remember that they're all part of the system as well. To successfully assemble and restore these ecosystems on which we depend for food and fiber, shelter, clothing, and a whole host of ecosystem services, we really need to remember those words of Aldo Leopold. We not only, though, need to keep all the cogs in the wheels, we need to keep all the interactions. We need to keep the complexity. And we need to understand how we're part of that and we can work with them. Thank you very much.
I was wondering, at a certain point you showed the pond in the middle, or the marsh in the middle of the woods, and you said that there was a surprisingly few amount of, that's a picture, species here, given that it's sort of in the middle of nowhere. And I'm wondering, is there really anywhere on the earth now that's in the middle of nowhere that isn't really touched by people? And can we say that anymore?
Bill McKibben argued in 1989 that was the end of his book, The End of Nature, that there was no place that was untouched because we were already modifying the climate system. If you discount the climate system and say, well, there are other places we could go where we could see all the wildlife intact, the answer is probably nowhere. But I think the other important point here is that it's not us going to see it, right? We're part of this system too. We're another species involved in this whole play. We like to think that we can think about that, as opposed to just sort of do what all the other species do, which is eat and reproduce and live and die our lives. We are very adaptable. We have evolved in many different ways and changed in many different ways, and we can occupy and use most parts of the planet. I think one of the most striking things to me, besides, walking around this particular bog and thinking I should see a moose and not seeing a moose, on the same trip when I was in Palau, I went through the island of Kosrae, where one of the pictures of the mangroves was taken. Any of you ever been to Kosrae? Any of you know where Kosrae is? So you get on the plane, Air Micronesia, and you go from Hawaii to Johnson Atoll, where they take apart nuclear weapons, to some other atoll where they take apart chemical weapons, to, I guess that would be Kwajalein, somewhere else. And then eventually, 10 hours later of island hopping, you get to Kosrae. And it's in the middle of nowhere in the Pacific. Absolutely nowhere. And we're walking along this path from our boat, which got stuck in the mud when the tide went out because the plane was 4 hours late and we missed the tide. We're walking along, and here's this guy, 14-year-old, 15-year-old kid, with an LA Raiders hat and a weed whacker. In a place where the GDP is about $3 a day and everyone lives on subsistence living, he's got a weed whacker and an LA Raiders hat. I don't know. I don't know if there's anywhere to go. There was an interesting article in the Globe the other weekend about where can you go and not get cell phone reception. Turn your cell phone off. That's the same deal.
So increasingly, I think it's becoming clear that we're missing a lot of these parts, the screws to the camera, or other vital parts that I think we have for centuries or millennia. Do you think that these parts can be replaced by proxies, or what do you think about the idea of rewilding?
So there are two questions there. There's the question. One of the questions is about functional redundancy in systems. Are there species that do unique things in an ecosystem, and are there species that can swap out for other species? And in our work with the hemlocks, we argue that eastern hemlock is one example of what we call a foundation species, which is a species that really is a critical piece in the system that's not replaceable. But there are other species that may be replaceable in terms of particular kinds of ecosystem functions or ecosystem services that we know how to measure and that we care about. There are lots of things we don't know how to measure, and lots of questions we don't know how to ask. But at some level, it's not obvious, for example, why we need 1 million species of beetles. Maybe 10,000 would do okay, or whether we even have them described right. But there's a lot of discussion about whether these species are functionally replaceable by still existing species or not. The rewilding question is another question. All of you know about rewilding, heard that term. So the idea is that there used to be, for example, a lot of big camel-like things and lion-like things in the middle of North America, and they're not there anymore. Most of them probably got eaten well before we got here to look at, Europeans got here to look at them. And there's this notion, for example, that we might be able to replace them with lions or tigers or cheetahs or other things from other parts of the world, and they could fill the same functional role in the system. I love the concept, right? I love the just like I love the concept of having wolves back in New England or having moose back in New England. The idea that we know enough about these systems to take a really important predator or a really important herbivore from a system where it's evolved for hundreds of thousands or millions of years and put it in a novel environment where there's grass, there are bison to eat, there are things like that, but it's a whole different landscape. The climate is different, the people are different, the plants are different, the fragmentation is different. The ranchers who don't want their sheep to get eaten, they're still there. But there's a lot of unpredictability there. The parallel example is biological control. Lots of problems with invasive and exotic species. Something comes in, eats the wrong thing, you got to get rid of it. So you go back to where it came from, and you find the thing that eats it in its home country, and you bring it to the place where it's invaded, and you breed it, and you release it, and it eats something else. And now you got two problems on your hand. Most of you probably saw the article in the New York Times about 2 months ago about New Zealand and the rabbits, and this is the same screws thing. So the wildlife ecologists have spent 50 years, 30 years now, eradicating cats from Macquarie Island that the Australians have. Cats are bad. They eat birds. They eat endangered seabirds. We got to get rid of the cats. They got rid of the cats and the rabbits exploded. The rabbits ate all the vegetation. Now they got to get rid of the rabbits. Oh, well, we better think about the rabbits and the mice and the rats. They can get rid of those, and they're going to have another problem from something else that those things have been controlling that they didn't know about. I don't know if we know enough to do that. But like I say, it's a very attractive idea. I don't know how the sheep farmers would like it. 2 questions in the back.
Can you give us a glimpse into your decision-making with Nick Gatelli as to what to exclude and what to include in the faunas, floras, and bacteria of the plant-held waters of your pitcher plant work? Because I would imagine you're doing a sort of core species versus high turnover, unmeaningful colonists kinds of distinctions, and
yeah,
it sort of ties back into what you're originally addressing in terms of who doesn't get invited to the assessment in terms of plant community ecologists.
And we have the same problem here. One of the nice things about this particular food web is that it's remarkably simple. So we've got 2 high-level predators. We've got a mite that eats rotifers and 3 other species of common species of protozoa. There's, of course, a whole tail of uncommon things that show up once in a while. There's one midge that breaks things down. The same top predator, when it's little, also breaks things down. The big black box, as it were, the big unknown that we're not dealing with are the couple of hundred species of bacteria sitting here that are all, we don't know anything about them, right? Celeste Peterson and Primrose Boynton spent a summer going around looking at sequencing these things. We've got hundreds of species of bacteria and yeasts. And so this is a very telling example. I don't have the slide to illustrate it, but we manipulated the top predators. We manipulated these 2 top predators. We manipulated the main shredder in the system. We didn't manipulate the protists, and we didn't manipulate the bacteria. Part of our motivation for this was to try and understand what controls the abundance of these different taxa. Is it habitat size? Is it predation? Part of the motivation deriving from a bunch of our other work is what all of these creatures are basically breaking down the prey and feeding the plant. And so we've been interested for a long time in how nutrients move from the ants that drown in here through this food web and into the plant, and how that's being affected by nitrogen deposition and other climate change. And what we've been working on based on literature work for years is that, predators are important, habitat size is important, how many prey you get is important. You've got this known commensalism. You take the predator away, you lose the shredder, the whole thing collapses. We finally sat down and did some isotope work to see which part of this food web really drives the nutrient part, right? Does it really matter for the plant what's going on in this food web? And the answer is no. What matters are the things we don't know anything about, the bacteria. So you take the whole food web away except the bacteria, and the plant gets the same amount of nutrition out of it. So if you treat this as a lake surrounded by rock, then you get one set of answers. If you add the pitcher plant back into this and say, how does it interact with this food web, then you start saying, well, the bacteria are really important and these other things are somewhat less important. You know. People, zoologists, animal ecologists have spent, 100 years working on the little ponds. I think the reason that we've been funded to do this at all is because we deal with the plant at the same time. And in dealing with the plant at the same time, the interaction that shows up is that the bacteria are really important, and we're just evolving the tools now to deal with the bacteria.
I think it's gotten pretty late. Why don't we end now, and there's going to be a reception outside, and you can talk to Aaron one-on-one. So let's thank Aaron again.
And hey, you can all come out to visit the Harvard Forest. It's close.